And the 2% women that get funded make 35% more return on investment on average. So just statistically, women are way superior entrepreneurs, but they are not hockey stick dudes. I think this is really that's one element here, is really this patriarchal societal structure, especially in the West and in the North that we have, that we just need to break apart and break down. We have this Women Entrepreneurs Award, and the solutions that come out of there, it's just so different. Just the approach towards growth, sustainability, innovation that women leaders have, at least in my personal experience, is so much better, because from the get-go, it's about solidarity rather than competition, because the challenges that we're facing are so huge. I mean, there's enough space for everyone to bring a perfect solution.
Where lust for a whole life and nothing but less makes people jump out of a comfortable pond into an unknown ocean. Welcome to that journey between the East and the West. Who says rolling stones don't gather moss? Hello everyone, I am Meenu Gupta, your host for the day, and I'm delighted to have you join me every week as amazing people share their incredible and inspiring life stories of straddling continents. Thank you.
At a time when the world is confronting deep divides between wealth and poverty, innovation and access, North and South, East and West, my guest for today, Stefan Wilhelm, is part of a growing movement that's reimagining how global corporations and foundations can contribute meaningfully to the well-being of communities often left behind. Stefan is a social innovation veteran. Before joining Bayer Foundation, he helped build and scale 2 award-winning social impact startups in Europe and Latin America, where he also worked for the Latin American Development Bank. At Bayer Foundation, Stefan is responsible for social innovation program portfolios, as well as the impact measurement and management, focusing on scalable high-impact ventures in access to health enhancement. Today, we'll talk about social innovation not as a charity, but as a strategy for resilience. We'll explore how we can bridge global perspectives between East and West, public and private, grassroots and institutional, to create real lasting change. Stefan, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure is mine.
So when I dive in, you're at the forefront of driving social impact through a major global foundation. Now, what does the word impact personally mean to you today in a world full of complexity and contradiction?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So first of all, I think impact in general is it's a term that's pretty hard to define, because it means a lot of different things for different people. So usually in the social innovation space where I'm active, we talk about outputs. So inputs, outputs, outcomes, and then at some point impact. So impact can be a lot of different things, but in this day and age right now, for me, impact means sustainably changing people's livelihoods, vulnerable people's livelihoods for the better. That's, I think, how I would put it.
Thank you for that. So changing livelihoods for the better. Now, we often talk about East and West as cultural or geographical poles. Now, in your work, where do you see these worlds coming together or clashing in the context of health and equity?
Well, first of all, there's obviously a divide in financing and a divide in accessibility to quality healthcare services, not just between East and West, especially between North and South, let's say. But I see the issue mainly in the prejudices that exist and in kind of the fear that players have. And which is why they don't want to interact as much. I mean, looking at China, for example, as a player, there's always there's a lot of uncomfortable feelings in dealing with culturally different kind of players from different environments. However, in my personal experience, there's a lot of innovation, grassroots innovation, but also systems change level innovation in healthcare going on in the large communities and also the major players that we have on the ground, because there are such vast populations that face huge challenges that demand innovative solutions, like Dr. V's hospitals, for example, in India. I think that's a really good example where supposedly its healthcare services are inferior, in rural India, but then the cataract surgeries were, since the 70s, put up in a way that it's basically like mass surgery production, quote unquote. And ultimately, there were also people from Great Britain, for example, flying into India to get these cataract surgeries because they were just qualitatively so much better than, and ultimately cheaper than what they would get through the National Healthcare Service in the UK. So I think there are a lot of these examples. There's reservation, prejudices, and kind of stories that are being repeated. But at the same time, there's a lot of potential in learning from each other, how to bring digital health, for example, to rural populations. I mean, this is something that will vastly grow also in Germany alone. In the East, you will have rural aging populations that don't have access to quality healthcare because there are no doctors. And then you have solutions from Sub-Saharan Africa that make that possible through telemedicine. Zuri Health is an example, fastest growing med tech company on the African continent. And we can benefit from that. We can benefit from each other's expertise. We just need to lose the fear of dealing with the quote unquote other. That's how I see those challenges.
That was very nicely put, and it throws up more questions. Fear of the other. I think you've opened a can of worms there. And you mentioned reservations and prejudices. Can you go a little deeper in this? Because we are sitting in a world right now where what I'm seeing sitting here is the evolution of technology so that one can actually handle some situations and some issues, both east, west, south, north, you call it. However, I think, as you rightly put, fear of the other and reservations and prejudices, it's leading to more clashes, more wars, so conflicts. I'm putting it in a very simple way. However, in your experience, because you worked both in both sides of the world, and when you say reservations, prejudices, fear of the other, can you give an example, and what was, or is, and what could be?
Yes. There are, of course, a lot of large-scale and small-scale examples of this. There is the whole diplomacy part on a policymaking and political level that poses lots of challenges and offers also possibilities to work together and for solutions. But to give you a very practical example, people with disabilities are regarded differently in different parts of the world. And there are solutions in the inclusion space that turn this around for everyone. So, because that's a fear of the quote unquote other that exists everywhere. So if you have a visually impaired or blind person somewhere, they will be regarded with some reservation. I mean, depending on the cultural context, there's also quite some backlash against people with disabilities. So they're marginalized even further and so on. So you need solutions that show that there is potential in this kind of vulnerable community. So the project that I worked on for CAF, the development bank in Colombia and Mexico, but also in Germany, is a social enterprise called Discovering Hands. And here, a gynecologist, Frank Hoffman from Germany, had the idea to use the extraordinary tactile sense of blind and visually impaired women in early breast cancer detection, because the incidence rises globally everywhere. And especially in low and middle income countries, there are hardly any employment opportunities for people with disabilities because they're excluded from the labor market. And overall, globally in societies, there's a lack of active inclusion. So now if you put this into practice, these women find 50% more and 30% smaller lumps in the breast tissue compared to trained physicians. They're just better at it because if you don't see, you need to compensate. So you use your tactile sense. And now, when we implemented this, the first pilot was in Cali in the southwest of Colombia. You have no idea how the life of each individual woman was turned around, because all of a sudden you're not the vulnerable, disabled person, quote unquote, but you have a talent that can positively influence and contribute to society. So you become a breadwinner. You could see this. I personally could see this physically in the women that we trained, walking crouched over to upright, even though they can't see. And it's like this win of independence. So that's one example of where solutions from the social innovation space can actually build bridges and kind of help kind of bridge the divide. Where I see a lot of issues is in the classic development aid scenario, because it just doesn't work. And it all builds on you in the global south, quote unquote, need to learn how to do things right. And us from the north and the west, we're going to show you how to do it because we are in the power position. And I see the narrative changing a little bit. This is where players like China, for example, come in, who have more of a flexible viewpoint on what this means, what collaboration means. You can criticize a lot about that, but you have facts like the Chinese government being able to lift 800 million people out of poverty in the past 30 years. And this is in the Western kind of development aid discussion, this is completely disregarded. Like there's no acknowledgement of this, just as there is little acknowledgement for the solutions. There's always this, I would call it something like a post-colonial power imbalance, that it's still kind of the attitude towards Southern and Eastern kind of solutions and players is predominantly negative. And that's something where this is where I see a lot of clashes. And concretely, what this leads to is that changing government, like in the US right now, can basically have extremely devastating effects on people that are dependent on receiving vaccines, essential medications, and so on, because it's not a big budget for a country like the US. But if you look at the consequences that this has on Sub-Saharan Africa as a continent, this is devastating. And this has a direct influence on reasons for people to migrate towards the north, which again, kind of in an echo chamber, reproduces negative backlash towards those populations, those vulnerable populations that are left alone. But the reason why this happens is because of an historical power imbalance. And that is the responsibility rather of the Europeans or the global north, because they reproduced the image of us being superior and the other being inferior. So for me, this is something that's more of a global viewpoint, where the solution, at least for me and in my recent experience, lies is in actual, real, eye-level collaboration. And collaboration not in the, inflationary sense that everybody's using it, but in concrete results. Because it feels like even now, before all these challenges, this absolutely humongous $120 billion hole that we have in humanitarian and development aid budgets every year, still, it feels like everybody is sitting in a silo that's open at the top and they're waving a little collaboration flag to say like, hey, come collaborate with me in my bureaucracy, with my process, in my committee, in my hierarchy, and of course, branding everything, rather than actually reaching out and working together, not only between corporate foundations, development aid agencies, governments, and so on, but individuals as well, but also with whomever you're collaborating with, meaning, from my perspective, essentially scalable social enterprises on the ground that have solutions that work, like insurance, for example, access to insurance, access to healthcare services in general, all kinds of digital innovations that help make people's lives better under the given circumstances. So I see, on the one hand, these huge conflict challenges, it's like 500 years of prejudices that we still need to get rid of, that we can't really seem to shake somehow. And the counter movement of the Trump administration firing up all of the hatred and the negativity and all of that. And at the same time, the necessity for real, concrete, radical collaboration without regard to ego or branding. And that's where I work. That's where I see, to kind of end a long answer to that question, where I see a lot of clashes and conflict potential still between cultures and systems, but where there's also a lot of opportunity, because now the tree has been shaken. So things need to be reordered and reorganized. And I think these private actors can help play a pivotal role here in the creation of public goods, obviously, but only through radical collaboration. Because if we don't do that, we're never going to fill that hole. But it needs to be collaboration between the players that have the money and the innovators on the ground that have the solutions. For me, that's key.
So that's interesting. The words have now been used, radical collaboration. So what I hear is the following, and do correct me from where I heard, and I'm just putting it together. When you say radical collaboration, you are meaning that instead of A and B going as top-down approach, A looking down upon B, hey, I have money and I have a solution and I'm going to help you solve a problem. Instead of doing that approach, we are saying instead of from, we do with. Because the solution needs to come from the problem itself, and innovation can happen at B's end as well, which will actually might benefit A in the longer run, and A and B together. Is that what I understand?
Yes. Plus, I think one element that could and should be added, especially in the entrepreneurial space, is the gender lens. Because that's another thing. We have a patriarchal inheritance that we carry around with us that's terrible, and that, I don't know, makes us lose out on vast opportunities in socially beneficial solutions. Because if you just look at, I think these are US numbers, and I don't know if I can be quoted on this, but I think it was 98% of all venture capital. So investment going to solutions that could be scaled, enterprises that have a technical or whichever solution that can be grown to big companies. 98% of the venture capital goes from men to men. 98%. So, and the 2% women that get funded make 35% more return on investment on average. So just statistically, women are way superior entrepreneurs, but they are not hockey stick dudes. I think this is really that's one element here, is really like this patriarchal societal structure, especially in the West and in the North that we have, that we just need to break apart and break down. We have this Women Entrepreneurs Award, and the solutions that come out of there, it's just so different. Just the approach towards growth, sustainability, innovation that women leaders have, at least in my personal experience, is so much better. Because from the get-go, it's about solidarity rather than competition. And it's about, because the challenges that we're facing are so huge. There's enough space for everyone to bring a perfect solution. So there's no loser to this game. And I remember being in a virtual kind of pitching environment where we had our pre-finalists for the Women Entrepreneurs Award cohort, I think 2 or 3 years ago. And there was this virtual back room where my colleague and I were sitting to have a chat with the entrepreneurs. They were in the other virtual rooms, they were pitching to investors and donor organizations and so on. And then every time when there were 2 female entrepreneurs in this virtual room with us, they would start pitching each other's ideas immediately. Like they would do an elevator pitch for the competitor. You'd be like, hey, wait, you need to give her the money. This is the best invention since sliced bread. So take this. I was sitting there and I was thinking, okay, if this would have been only men, that would have never happened. So I think this is another element that we need. We need more female leadership, equity, of course. But right now, I think it's also time to swing back the pendulum a little bit. It's like Ruth Bader Ginsburg said famously, right? When somebody asked her, wow, you always advocate for more women in the Supreme Court. When do you think it's going to be enough? And then she says, well, when it's only women. It's like, what? That's so unfair. And then she says, well, it's been 350 years, only men. So that's, I think, another element here that needs to change, just to add.
That was so interesting. Stefan, the women listeners are going to love you. You just said women entrepreneurs, if I remember the words correctly, are far superior. And some of the reasons, I believe you mentioned creativity of solutions, solidarity, and anything else that you saw in their leadership, in the way they handled their leadership?
The inclusivity. So it's less of a, inclusivity and inclusion. I mean that in a sense that there's more togetherness. It's about reaching a common goal rather than me first, because the me first solutions have never been successful. Even if you look at the large tech companies like Apple, I don't know about Google, but Facebook and a bunch of others. Actually, a friend of mine gave a speech about this once. If you look at who made them actually grow, it was never men. It was almost always women who had COO roles, actually doing organizational development, personnel leadership. That's also something by feeling that you are the gorilla in the room that's superior to everybody else, you're not going to grow an organization and make people happily work for you. That's more of a regimen of fear and kind of pressure. And that's what typically, at least in my experience, these women leaders don't do. And they're much quieter. They don't need to brag as much as men, statistically at least, for them. And why they get so much more funding is because they talk to the same people as they are. So dude who made a big company happen with hockey stick graphs is going to give money to the hockey stick dude that is pretentious and probably doesn't have the best idea, but he can sell it the best, or at least in our terms. And that's what I mean, like the general perception of success. What is success? Why are you good? What's innovative? What's considered as good is still dominated very much by this patriarchal ideal that I'm personally very much against. I work in an all-female team, basically. So I'm the male for the quota, let's say. And I've never had bad experiences with female leadership. Of course there is. We're all individuals, it's all different and so on. But I think if you add an element of also gender equity into the mix, you will necessarily have better results for everyone.
Now, this was phenomenal. Because now there's another context now comes into the picture. Because men are considered to be on the other side, the alpha, and they bring the aggression. Now, women, from whatever I nowadays read a little bit on social media, LinkedIn, it is said that they are trying to wedge in with aggression, but they have to do that to try to get their voices heard. And when they say something, it is taken as being aggressive, while when a man says that, it is taken as normal. He's being assertive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And those are the things, like, how do you know that a given concept in whichever, but for me, especially if you talk about vulnerable populations, people at the base of the economic pyramid, how do you include them? You need to listen to them. You need to listen to the people that you actually want to serve. And this is something that women, at least in my experience, I can only talk from my personal experience here, but that they do much better. Instead of imposing solutions that you, with your male genius, developed in your garage, it's just not how it should work. And that's also not how it will work in the future. And I see a lot of movement towards this because also in my opinion, every movement creates a counter movement as well. So this move, centuries backward with the Trump administration also creates a counter movement where people say, no, we don't want to be like this. We don't believe that the world is going to be a better place if it's everyone against everyone and the country with the biggest stick wins. That's not how the world is going to evolve. And especially because what we're doing here, if you look at it from a policy level, of course, our foundation is smaller in comparison to others and so on. But if you work on these solutions and you enhance people's livelihoods on the ground, be it through better access to healthcare, access to input or climate risk insurance and so on, you will make their lives better in order for them to stay where they are, because people don't want to migrate, but they have to because they're just out of opportunities on the ground. So what you see, this protectionist, aggressive kind of momentum that's dominant currently, this will lead to more migration toward the north, which will create more conflict. So if you do collaboration right, you will support solutions that highlight, in my opinion also, which is important, highlight locally led, locally bred innovations that you can scale so that people want to stay and build their own livelihoods in their homeland. I think that for that reason, it's also quite key. And that's a discussion that we never really have on the policy level.
So interesting. While the world is a small place and time just shrank, global going local. This is a paper I wrote 30 years ago. So when we were discussing multiple brands, etc., and that's a paper I wrote 30 years ago, and now we're just discussing that. So time just shrank. And no, I totally agree with you there. And now you, as I think you generally have this throwing up a can of worms, opening them, which is good actually, airing. There are two things now, because you brought up gender in very important points actually. I go back a bit. In your definition then, what is diversity and what is inclusion? Because these two words have been bandied around, much abused, I think, much used also in the last 5 years across the world, across corporations, the public space as well as in politics. And it's a very cosmetic word is what I see largely. Now, I could be wrong. From whatever you've been mentioning in your experiences, do share your version of lived version of diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, so there's the general definition of the term, of course, inclusion being primarily historically used in relation to people with disabilities. So that's the UNCRPD, for example, and granting accessibility to people, wheelchair users, but also people with visual impairment, hearing impairment, and so on. So that's one part of it. But then there's also the inclusion of diverse characters in general. So meaning if you speak a different language, if you come from a different cultural context, if you have a different gender or some kind of different gender identity and so on, that the society that you live in pays attention to also giving you a chance to fully participate in society. I think this is something, and corporates honestly aren't good at doing that, at least in Germany, and also I have to really advocate my employer here. I mean, there's been a lot of backlash against Bayer recently for debatable reasons, but in terms of the inclusion policies, it's fine. And the company sticks to it. They stuck by it, the board of management stuck by it, despite all of the backlash that comes from the US against this terminology also. There was no question that this would still be kept because it's important for a global company to retain the best talent. And the best talent doesn't stop at any kind of gender, color, skin, language, or any other disability that you may have. So those are the two terms. One is the historic, more kind of disability-related use of the term, what I see as inclusion. So also infrastructure that is made accessible and so on. And then there's more the global term of inclusion of people of different origins with different kind of attitudes and so on that have a chance, that are given a chance to fully participate. And diversity is technically used most of the time either in a gender context or in a color skin context. So that's how I've perceived it in public use. It's more like, yes, okay, we also need non-white people and some women on the team picture so that it doesn't look so white male. It's kind of the historic definition for me. And like you said, it's been kind of abused also sometimes as a term. But if you take diversity seriously, it also means diversity of thought, diversity of generations, diversity of attitudes, or neurodiversity, for example. That is not necessarily a quote unquote disability, but it's just being different should be welcomed, and you should live in an environment where your being different is also being put to use for everybody's benefit. So those are Yeah. And then there's the equity piece in the middle, right? Which is kind of obvious, I think.
Now we are talking. So you've gone beyond the cosmetic use of the term. And I will add to that. Diversity, as I see it, also is we are born into diversity. The world is the universe. It's diverse in every which way. In the world of nature, the way different plants and in diverse plants grow in diverse parts of the planet, and they also acclimatize. Amazingly, when you take one plant to another part of the world, they also acclimatize. I see it as a beautiful way of diversity. We are born into diversity with different people in a family, and across, whether it's family, community, organizations, politics, everywhere, diversity exists the moment you start breathing on the planet in every which way. Now, having said that, as you rightly said, inclusion is that process where these diverse voices are given their way of space. Their voices are heard, they are seen, they are acknowledged, and when they are seen and heard, they get a sense of belonging. And what I have noticed in the last couple of years while talking to amazing people from different walks of life, be it in the corporate space, non-profits, governance, or as far off as even monks and in Hollywood, what I noticed is the following, and in the peace building space and sustainable space, what I noticed is when people get a sense of belonging, when they are included, when inclusion really takes place in a room, anywhere, across the globe. It could be Africa or America, anywhere. At that particular juncture, you can happily use the word inclusion because they are now feeling that sense of belonging. And when people, now this is for the corporates out there, hey, you guys and ladies, when people have that sense of belonging, they outperform. They give 200% of themselves. They wish to and they do it willingly, even for a lesser pay, if that can be said. They do it from their hearts. And when they also belong, there is a sense of peace which fills them and therefore their communities, their families, and there's lesser chances of conflict, leading to more peace-building efforts, effortless. And if we had to even go to the UN definition, a sustainable world, that is a sustainable world. So diversity, inclusion, belonging, leading to a sustainable world. So it's sort of just added to your wonderful experience of diversity and inclusion. Just wanted to add that because I heard this from different people and it gave me an opportunity to stitch their thoughts together in a complete whole, because we are working between the East and the West. And that made such a good fabric. When I heard these multiple experiences, it made such a wonderful whole fabric when I also, from people who went in the courses of migration from one end of the world as migrants and rose in the other. They faced a lot of backlash, color, etc. And they rose by just being understanding, compassionate, listening, and refusing to treat the other as the other, even though the other was treating them as the other. So in that, they just showed compassion till the point where suddenly they belonged to that room. And they could add more value than was ever imaginable before, let's say, the whites or blacks or whoever, diversity, than the value which existed before. So it was interesting. Now, getting on from there, what was a moment in your career that made you pause and think, this is why I do this work?
Oh, there were quite a few, I would say. But yeah, well, in my past life, helping social enterprises grow, there was this moment that I actually already mentioned when I was working in Cali at the Blind and Visually Impaired Children's Institute, actually, where we had the classes for the women to be trained as medical tactile examiners. That's the name of the profession that Dr. Hoffman invented, basically. There was especially one woman, Francia, who was a tiny person from a very vulnerable neighborhood in the city. And she just impressed me to a degree that still to this day gives me goosebumps. Because when she started doing the course, she was already small, but she was really kind of huddled and this crouched little figure with her white cane. When the 9-month course was over, she grew by at least 10 centimeters. She walked upright with her cane because she transformed from being the recipient of aid, which is also not available in a country like Colombia, unfortunately, to the breadwinner of the family. Like this, the change in self-perception, that really, okay, this makes me get up in the morning. And even if my salary doesn't really cover the rent, I don't care. I'm still going to plow forward with this because if that's something I can contribute to, I just have to do it. And these women, they came by public transportation. We started these courses at 7 a.m. and all of them were always there at 6:45 on their own. If you would blindfold me in a place like Cali and give me a white cane, after 5 minutes, I'd fall into a ditch and you'd never see me again. It's just the amount of also contribution, motivation, and kind of, the straw that they string to and say, finally, there's something where I can prove my worth is just unbelievable. And of course, that's a slow growth model. It takes 9 months. Each of these courses had like maybe 10, 15 women in them. But then they go on and they find micro alterations that you can hardly see in radiology, on a mammography. They find it with their fingertips. It's like you just want wow, this is like a superpower. So those are the stories. And there are countless stories of these women actually having saved lives by finding alterations in the breast tissue. So that's something where you have a really direct contribution. You get up in the morning, you do something, and at the end of the day, if another woman has a job, then you did something right. If she doesn't, well, you better improve your performance. So this is one of those pivotal moments. And the other one was now when we redesigned the program landscape of Bear Foundation, the social innovation program, and we landed this huge project with a fantastic, also woman entrepreneur. It's a woman and a man leading Pula and Pula Foundation. So Rose Goslinger and Thomas Njeru from Kenya, they came up with a solution to give insurance against climate risks to smallholders. So basically, if you're somewhere in rural Kenya and there's drought, then, you have no harvest, no food, no money, and no seeds. And really small amounts, like $15 payouts, can help extremely well if you are able to at least buy a new bag of seeds to plant your corn again, for example. So we landed a project and it's running. We're going to insure at least 10 million smallholder farmers in 7 countries against climate risks until the end of 2030. Contributing, by the way, also to Bayer's overall sustainability agenda very heavily. And these are externally auditable figures. But the key moment here was, that's just phenomenal in its own right. But then Rose, the co-founder of Pula, she held this presentation talking about systems change level intervention through this type of insurance. And what she showed on a graph, I think it was Zambia. Yeah, maybe I'm remembering wrong, but it was definitely, I think it was Zambia as a country where you had 2 graphs. One was the development of the GDP and then the development of the corn harvest. And the development of the corn harvest and the GDP were almost exactly the same. So corn harvest up, GDP up, corn harvest down, GDP down. Because the dependency on corn harvest is so big in a country like Zambia, for example, and this is the kicker, she showed, and here in the statistics, you see an insurance payout. And this was for the country level, was like $40 million or something, which sounds really small, but it changed the development of the GDP. Despite the corn harvest being lower, there's a bounce back effect for the farmers because they get a payout from the insurance. And that was something where I was like, okay, wow. So with something as simple as $15 insurance payouts for rural smallholder farmers, you can change the entire GDP because they're not completely, sorry, excuse my French, but screwed because they don't get anything back. They at least get something. And that's where also I think, okay, you can move the needle. if you do this right, you can move the needle. Yeah, now it's going to be in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Ghana, Mali, and Malawi that we're going to do this with the government. And Kenya, of course. And we just signed an MOU with the Kenyan Ministry of Agricultural Affairs, and we're going to insure at least 600,000 farmers until the end of the year there. So this is where I say, and it's not me doing that. I mean, we are the not-for-profit entity that gives grants to subsidize these premiums. And that's also, again, how do you have an effect like this? So how it worked for us in Zimbabwe in a pilot was we invested $200,000 in a pilot program to demonstrate to the government that input insurance for smallholders works. Because they, first of all, they don't trust the concept of insurance because they were, I mean, sorry again, but screwed multiple times where the insurance just doesn't pay and then they're out of money. And the second is the concept is also not entirely, it's very abstract. When you say, okay, I'm paying for something that I don't want to happen, then when it doesn't happen, I don't get my money back. It's like, it's really weird. I'd rather keep my money. So the government, on the other hand, doesn't want to be the first mover, doesn't want to take a risk, doesn't want to spend money. So then Rose proposed to us, okay, what we can do is we do this pilot, and that those were premiums for 30,000, 31,000 farmers that we subsidized. And then a year into this project, to engage the government, there was drought, which is terrible. But for our project, it was actually, quote unquote, the best thing that could happen, or the worst thing, because then there was a payout of the insurance. So it's local insurance companies, it's backed by large multinational reinsurance companies, but you have local payouts of $15. And usually you have these stages and then money is given out. So the farmers were happy because, of course, they got some money back to buy seeds. But the government saw this and thought, of course, this might make me look really good if I engage here. And because on the other hand, who has the most interest in supporting smallholders? Well, it's the government, because 80% of the food is being produced by them in a given country. So if they are out of seeds, you have a problem in general in your country. So then what happened was they took it up and they scaled it and they subsidized the premiums for 1 million farmers. So now we've actually gone from 30,000 in our pilot to 1 million, over 1 million farmers with active insurance policies now. And that's a third of the farming population of the country. And the government invests, they subsidize it. And then eventually, now this should start now, they're scaling down their subsidy because the farmers start understanding the value, and also they trust the process because they see that if drought hits or flood hits, they get paid. So then if you take this from a 30,000 million to a 10 million, 15 million beneficiary base, it's a business model for this insurance platform. If it's $1 a month and you have 30,000 customers, of course, it's not a business case. But if you have 20 million customers that are willing to pay for this, first of all, you have a business case. And second, it's there to stay. So it's not development aid charity, but it's a model that will work in the long run. And that's, very long story, but this is on the first story was on the direct individual personal level. And this is like more the systems change approach level where you can demonstrate that something like insurance that everybody says doesn't work in a geography like Zimbabwe, you could prove them wrong and demonstrate that the farming population that's really vulnerable can profit from.
Thank you. These wonderful stories, actually, Stefan. Beautiful act from an individual level and the other level, an institutional level, how change can happen. And I absolutely loved it. Now, my question to you is, which I've been dying to ask, is, and I forgot to ask, how and why did you get into the field of social impact? What drove you?
A variety of factors, of course. But first of all, my parents were entrepreneurs. They were in the very early days in the 70s and 80s, they were part of the health food movement. And they founded one of the largest distributors of organic food in Germany. Back then, we were still like extraterrestrials, health food and like all of this weird stuff. I got a lot of backlash in primary school for being the hippie kid with the organic food. And now you can buy it at Aldi. Like it's really, if you look at the development, it's really, they were part of they were ahead of their time, of course, but they were part of something that actually changed society massively. And so this entrepreneurial kind of gene runs in the family. My grandfather was an entrepreneur. So it's like, I think that's one thing. And the second is my parents also taught me through their living example that what you should do is invest your time, the time that you have, the limited time that you have on this planet, in something that's worthwhile, because otherwise you might as well just not do anything. So it was kind of mirror to me. And I did at an early age, did a lot of student exchanges. I went to camp on a scholarship to the US with like 60 different nationalities and so on. It's all about intercultural exchange and so on. I was always interested in foreign languages and those types of things. Did community service in the US, but then studied in Brazil and so on. So there was always this intercultural kind of element where I was directly exposed to inequality, also crass inequality that I didn't know from Germany. Because now the divide is growing, but back in the day, this was like a very safe place to grow up in, and it felt like everybody was kind of equal. And then you go to a place like Rio, and there's super rich people live directly next to a favela, and I just wondered, like, how can you live with this? This is so schizophrenic. How can can't we do something about that? Why aren't there people out on the streets protesting against this inequality? So then I started dealing with, in my studies, and I studied intercultural and business studies, focusing on Latin America, actually. But in the course of those studies, I read Dassen's Development as Freedom and wrote my thesis about his capabilities approach, actually. So that it's not necessarily about what you do, but it's about the capabilities that you want, what you could do. And in essence, it's a book about, he's an economist, but it's a book about the multidimensionality of poverty and how to address it. And this led me to this whole social enterprise spectrum. And a friend of mine, very good friend of mine, actually started an internship with Ashoka back like 25 years ago when we were studying. And then he invited me to volunteer there and so on. So I got in touch with these social entrepreneurs, and it really kind of struck like lightning. And I was like, okay, this is where I want to work, because it's the best of both worlds. You take business models that solve societal issues. So that's, for me, it just made complete sense. And then I started working. So my friend Michael, he introduced me to Dialogue in the Dark in Hamburg, actually, in the Speicherstadt. And that's where I started my first job. So it was basically the inclusion and the social business part. And and from there, I just continued. So it's kind of a historic family connection together with personal interest and a course of studies that also kind of led to this.
So your parents left a legacy in you and through you.
I believe so, yeah.
In a polarized world, how do you then create trust across borders, sectors, and cultures? And how critical is that to achieving social change? Because in your experience, you've seen a lot, and I heard you, and I'm with you when you say the divides in many countries, the rich and poor divides are massive. And you use the right word, schizophrenic. One has that. How can one exist when you go out for a meal in a 5-star, and that meal's cost would pay the chauffeurs 1 month's salary who actually took you there, for example? So that is the divide in a very simple way. So having said that, how would you create trust across borders, sectors, and cultures? And how critical is that? From what you said, it seemed very critical. So I need to understand the how.
Well, in my personal view, this is everything. Trust is everything. If we don't trust each other, then nothing works, because then we are ruled by fear and by doubt and so on and so forth. So what I think, the way that I operate is maybe not, my wife likes to say, she's actually a Belgian Congolese, so we have a kind of a intercultural family construction of our own. And she has very explicit political views on what's going on in the world. And then at some point she said it, and this really stuck with me as a quote. It's like, okay, I want to change the world, and maybe I probably can't, but you know that you can't change the world, but you can change lives. So that's the approach. Because for me, there is a good reason to have large-scale political debates. I think that's an important part of our basic existence as a species, and it's very important, but that's not my prime way of addressing these issues. What I try to do is I try to find, so in terms of trust building, I try to find smallest common denominators between different groups And once you agree on something, even if it's very small, and you do something about it, then you have a point of reference that everybody agrees on. Then you already have, 3 or 4 organizations that want to work together, people that trust each other because you have a track record of having done something good together. So, very concrete example, how to build trust between supposed competitors is in a community of practice and health that I helped build. So how it happened was a friend of mine from an actual competing pharmaceutical company, interestingly enough, and we met at a conference, virtually actually, and then they run this Making More Health program. And with Discovering Health back in the day, we were part of the first cohort, so I kind of chat him up and asked, so does it still exist? Yes. And are you involved? No, but we're building up a social venture fund, so an investment fund for social enterprises. It's like, okay, so in what? In health? Yes, in health. Geographically, where? Sub-Saharan Africa. It's like, us too. That's also where we're active. Okay, and so who's in your pipeline? Organization ABC. I'm like, they're also in our pipeline. Who are you investing in? XYZ. Oh, we're also investing in them. So what are we doing? Because from my time in social enterprise, I remember how it is to get naked for 5K and then write 8 reports. It's like, that's the life of the social entrepreneur is 70% of your time you're doing fundraising and reporting, and 30% of the time you actually get to doing what you're supposed to do, meaning help someone and spread the solution. So we said, okay, I know on paper, we are competitors, but it doesn't make any sense to do this separately. Can't we get together somehow? And then at some point, Eleni came on board, Eleni Theodorou from We Share Forward Foundation, and she said, okay, we really have to, and she stuck the woman in the mix, started really scaling the network, and we grew from 2 organizations /3 to now 30 who are a member. And how it works is everybody signs an NDA, we sit together monthly, we share pipeline. It's Chatham House rules, so everybody kind of gets to share openly what the challenges and so on. And then sometimes one organization will have done due diligence already on a given enterprise, and another organization will have some kind of impact study on this topic. We can give grants, others can invest. It's all complementary. So we save effort that otherwise we would all have to reinvent the wheel 30 times. And like this, we try on a smallest common denominator level to get together. Okay, who are you focusing on? Somebody suggests then that we invite organizations to kind of pitch and present their solutions. And then you have a vote where people say, okay, I like it, I'm in, I can contribute XYZ, either money or non-financial support or something else. So that is trust. And this has really evolved into a kind of a submarine of collaboration across. Philips and Philips Foundation are part of this, Novartis, Sanofi, Boehringer Ingelheim, Swiss Re Foundation, like big corporates, like practically competitors, but we define this as a pre-competitive space where we just reached out in a leap of faith and realized that we all try to do the same thing and we should better do it together to ease the reporting burden on the side of the entrepreneur. Because how do you make these solutions grow? If you give more resources to the people who actually do it. Because and that's another thing that for me really worked in this trust building environment. Leave your ego out the door. It's not about us. It's not about the brand. It's not about the organization. It's not about showing off. It's about the result. And I found really a tribe there that trying to do more with, but that's one example of how you can build trust even in these times. You identify something that everybody agrees on and wants to do anyway, and you do it together, and then you have a point of reference where you say, hey, look, we're doing it together. And we're presenting this at large institutional capital conferences because everybody's into like, how are you doing that? You just have to do it and not talk about it all the time. So that's, again, long story short, but that's one way of doing it.
So it's lovely, actually. It's such a lovely share. So essentially, we are talking about what you had also mentioned before. Instead of the I and me culture, moving on to the we culture. Is essentially that. So instead of a spirit of competition to a spirit of collaboration, in the true sense, as a we. Well, that's wonderful. I support you completely. Now, if we fast forward to 2030, for example, what's a headline that you would like to read about the work that you do, A, and the work of the Bayer Foundation in the world of social impact? Just a thought.
Yeah, I would like to read something along the lines of, they said they were going to do it and they did. Kind of. So because we have these 2030 targets, Bayer as a company has a very steep sustainability targets, not just in terms of near zero, net zero, or net positives, and so on, scope 1 to 3 emissions and all these things, and supply chain and so on, but also in terms of social impact. So there are basically 300 million goals for each division. So consumer health, pharma, and crop science, and each of them addresses 100 million people in low and middle income countries. And in the smallholder spectrum, for example, it's 100 million smallholders per year, externally audited, should either be customers, of course, of buy products and so on, or a profit from some kind of service that the company offers, or benefit from non-commercial partnerships. And this is where we come in as a foundation to pay into this overall sustainability target. And the Pula collaboration that I mentioned, if it works, it'll pay at least 10% of this overall target into reaching this goal. So that's what I would like to read, is that we came as an organization, we promised something and we kept it, but in the meantime, we built an ecosystem. And I think that's really one of those other key words for me that's also used in an inflationary way, but building ecosystems helps, because then you identify complementarity between all the players, and the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And nobody is a loser in that game. And I think that's what I would like to read. It's a very long kind of headline, but maybe something like they promised they'd do it and they did together.
That was so wonderful. They promised that they would do it and they did it together. Wow, that's awesome, actually. So we wrap up our first discussion. We will have more, Stefan, hopefully, with this line, because it was so wonderful. It leads to the future from the past through the present into the future. So when one says or hears this line, it's hope. And it's a hope which is based on substance. Not something out there, one day, one fine day. Thank you for being with us today and for actually giving so much substance and value to the word social and to the word impact, and to actually helping to knit many elements around these words together. And thank you for your honesty.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the series Between the East and the West. Do subscribe to the channels mentioned on the site in case, of course, you liked what you heard. I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'll be looking forward to your comments. We love feedback. Thank you once again. Namaste and bye-bye.